The airport was alive with its usual mix of movement and noise. Families hugging goodbye, business travelers rushing to catch flights, security announcements echoing overhead. The smell of fresh coffee, jet fuel, and damp winter coats lingered in the air. TSA Officer Daniel Carter had been working security at Atlanta International for over a decade. Nothing surprised him anymore, until today. At his side, Shadow, a sleek black Labrador, sniffed the air, his ears twitching. He was one of the best detection dogs in the country, trained to sense explosives, narcotics, and even the faintest trace of danger. But today, something was off. Shadow was agitated, restless, his nose working overtime as they patrolled the terminal. Daniel felt the first twinge of unease when they neared Gate 47. The usual hum of airport life continued around him, oblivious to the tension creeping up his spine. Then, without warning, Shadow froze. His body stiffened, tail rigid, nostrils flaring. A deep, guttural whine escaped his throat, a sound Daniel had never heard before. Shadow wasn't just alerting. He was distressed. Daniel followed the dog's gaze to a single, unattended suitcase sitting beside a row of chairs. It was navy blue, medium-sized, the kind nearly every traveler carried. Nothing about it stood out, except for the fact that Shadow refused to move. A knot tightened in Daniel's stomach. He had been in this job long enough to know when a situation was about to escalate. Reaching for his radio, he kept his voice steady. Possible suspicious item at Gate 47. Shadow's reacting to it. Within seconds, security responded. The area was quickly sectioned off, passengers redirected, hushed voices growing into murmurs of concern. A woman who had been sitting near the suitcase clutched her purse and hurried away. Others exchanged nervous glances, whispering theories. Was it a bomb? Drugs? Some kind of smuggling operation? A bomb squad technician in full gear arrived, stepping forward with calm precision. The way he moved, measured, deliberate, only made the weight in Daniel's chest heavier. Shadow, still fixated on the suitcase, let out another sharp whine. Then came the moment of truth. With careful hands, the technician unzipped the suitcase. The tension in the air was suffocating. The airport, always filled with movement, seemed to pause. And then silence. The bomb tech's hands hesitated. His body went rigid. The breath Daniel had been holding caught in his throat. Because inside that suitcase was something no one expected. Something that made even the most hardened officers go quiet. And when they realized what they were looking at, no one, not even Daniel, could hold back the tears. The moment the suitcase was unzipped, the entire world inside Gate 47 seemed to shrink. The murmuring crowd, the shuffling of security boots, even the steady hum of the airport, everything faded into an eerie silence. Daniel Carter wasn't a man easily shaken. Years in airport security had trained him to expect the worst. He had seen it all. Drug busts, weapons smuggling, even families torn apart over immigration issues. But this was different. Shadow took a cautious step forward, his nose twitching. Daniel swallowed hard and peered over the bomb technician's shoulder. Inside the suitcase, carefully packed between layers of fabric, was a bundle wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. For a moment, Daniel thought, no, it couldn't be. His stomach clenched. His breath stilled in his chest. The bomb technician reached in with gloved hands, his movements slow, deliberate. When he pulled back the fabric, the truth hit them all like a punch to the gut. A baby, a newborn, no older than a few days, lay nestled inside the suitcase. Tiny fists curled up near its face, delicate lashes resting against plump cheeks. The child was eerily still. The only movement the subtle rise and fall of its tiny chest. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Someone in the distance whispered a prayer. A woman covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. Daniel felt his pulse thunder in his ears. He had braced himself for danger, an explosive, a deadly weapon, something that could turn this terminal into chaos. But instead, he was staring at something far more fragile, far more human. The bomb technician carefully lifted the baby, his bulky suit making the action clumsy, but heartbreakingly gentle. The child stirred at the sudden movement, a tiny whimper escaping its lips. Shadow, still hyper-focused on the suitcase, let out a soft, almost mournful whine. Daniel's mind raced. Who would do this? Why would someone leave a baby in a suitcase in the middle of an airport? Had the mother been in distress? Was this an act of desperation, or something much worse? He snapped back to reality as a paramedic rushed forward, taking the baby from the technician's arms. "We need to check vitals," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Baby's breathing, but weak." Daniel's grip on Shadow's leash tightened. His dog had sensed this before anyone else. Somehow, in the overwhelming scent of jet fuel, food courts, and thousands of rushing passengers, Shadow had smelled the faint trace of life hidden inside a suitcase. Daniel ran a hand down the dog's back, whispering, "Good boy," though his voice barely held steady. The paramedic wrapped the infant in a fresh blanket, checking for any immediate signs of distress. "Looks like mild dehydration," she muttered. "Cold skin, but no obvious injuries." Daniel exhaled through his nose, relief and confusion swirling inside him. A suitcase. A baby. Abandoned in one of the busiest airports in the country. The realization hit him like a truck. This wasn't just neglect. This was intentional. He turned sharply to one of the other security officers. "I need access to surveillance footage. Someone left this baby here, and I want to know who." The officer nodded and spoke into his radio, calling for immediate review of the cameras near Gate 47. Daniel looked back at the baby. The whimper had turned into soft, hiccuped breaths, tiny fingers curling into the fabric of the new blanket. Whoever had done this had walked away, leaving this child in the path of strangers, hoping, or maybe not hoping, that someone would find them in time. His jaw clenched. He had spent years catching criminals, stopping illegal contraband from getting through. But this was something different, something far worse. This wasn't just a case to be solved. This was a life hanging in the balance. And Daniel wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. The baby had been taken to the airport's emergency medical unit, wrapped tightly in fresh blankets, surrounded by professionals who whispered in hushed, urgent tones. But for Daniel, the real work was just beginning. Standing in the airport surveillance room, he watched the grainy footage on the screen, his fists clenched at his sides. The timestamp read 6:42 a.m., a little over an hour before Shadow's reaction had brought them to the suitcase. A figure moved into frame, walking with purpose. They were small, possibly a woman, but a heavy sweatshirt and a baseball cap hid most distinguishing features. The footage was shaky, the angle slightly off, but Daniel could see the moment the person bent down, placed the suitcase near Gate 47, and stood still for just a few seconds. Then the figure did something strange. They stepped back, hesitated, and touched the handle of the suitcase one last time before walking away. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He had seen people abandon bags before, panicked travelers, smugglers trying to dispose of something illegal, even criminals testing security response times. But this looked like goodbye. A sharp knock at the door made Daniel turn. It was Officer Rachel Monroe, one of the lead investigators on the airport security team. She had a thick folder under one arm and an expression that told Daniel this case wasn't going to be simple. "We ran prints on the suitcase," she said, stepping inside. "No match in the system." Daniel exhaled through his nose. Whoever left the baby here wasn't in any criminal database. Rachel flipped open the folder. But the suitcase itself, it wasn't new. It had a baggage tag from a flight 2 months ago. She handed Daniel a copy of the airline records. Daniel scanned the document. Flight 617, Mexico City to Atlanta. His eyes flicked to the name listed under checked luggage. Carmen Reyes. Rachel crossed her arms. "We're pulling customs records now, but there's no sign of anyone by that name on today's flight lists." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Who was Carmen Reyes? And where was she now? Shadow, who had been sitting obediently at Daniel's feet, suddenly stood up, ears perked. The dog's gaze locked on the screen, his tail stiff, his nose twitching as if the static-filled image held some unseen truth. Daniel crouched down, rubbing a hand over Shadow's back. "You still think something's off, huh?" The dog didn't move. his focus never wavering from the footage. Daniel's stomach churned. He had learned a long time ago to trust Shadow's instincts. He turned back to Rachel. "We need to find out who this woman is. If she's the mother, we need to know why she left that baby behind." Rachel nodded. "I already sent her name to Homeland Security. If she's crossed any borders recently, we'll know." Daniel ran a hand over his face. There were too many unknowns. The baby helpless and abandoned. A suitcase, intentionally left behind. And now a name. But no trace of the person who owned it. One thing was clear. This wasn't just a case of a desperate mother leaving her child behind. Something bigger was at play. And Daniel had a feeling that whatever it was far from over. Daniel paced the surveillance room, his mind racing through every possibility. The more he thought about it, the more something felt wrong. Not just about the baby, but about the entire situation. Rachel was already making calls, trying to track any trace of Carmen Reyes. But Daniel wasn't convinced they'd find her so easily. A mother who had gone through the trouble of flying internationally with her baby didn't just abandon them in an airport terminal without a reason, unless she had no other choice. The thought sent a shiver through him. Shadow let out a low huff, pacing near the door as if sensing the urgency in the room. Daniel knelt beside the dog, rubbing a reassuring hand over his sleek black fur. "Yeah, buddy. Something's off." Rachel hung up her phone, looking frustrated. Nothing. No records of Carmen Reyes booking a return flight. No address tied to her name. It's like she doesn't exist. Daniel frowned. What about the flight manifest? Did she have anyone traveling with her? Rachel flipped open the folder, scanning the documents again. Then she froze. Wait. Her finger traced a name on the list. She was traveling with an infant. The records confirm a baby was with her when she arrived in Atlanta. Daniel's stomach twisted. So we know the baby was hers. Rachel hesitated, then shook her head. No, we know she was responsible for a baby on paper. But without DNA confirmation, we can't say for sure. A disturbing thought crept into Daniel's mind. What if the baby wasn't hers at all? He clenched his jaw. Check if anyone else on that flight had a connection to her. Rachel nodded and started running the names. Daniel turned back to the surveillance footage, playing it again. The person who left the suitcase, their movements, the hesitation, the lingering touch on the handle. It nagged at him. And then something clicked. He rewound the footage to the moment the person walked away. He watched closely as they disappeared into the crowd. There, a brief moment where the camera caught the side of their face. It was a woman, and she was looking back. Her face was partially obscured by the baseball cap, but there was something in her expression, a mix of fear and finality. Daniel's gut twisted. This wasn't just someone getting rid of a child. This was someone saying goodbye. Rachel's phone buzzed again, and she quickly answered. Yeah, okay, yeah, send it over now. She hung up and looked at Daniel. You're not going to believe this. Daniel tensed. What? Rachel grabbed her laptop and opened an email attachment. A grainy passport photo filled the screen. This is Carmen Reyes. Daniel studied the image. A woman mid-30s, dark eyes, long black hair pulled back. She had a tired expression, like someone carrying too many burdens. Rachel clicked again, and another photo appeared. But this time, Daniel's pulse stopped. It was the same woman from the surveillance footage. Carmen Reyes had left the suitcase. And just like that, a second later, another image loaded on the screen. A missing persons report. Daniel's throat tightened. No. Rachel looked grim. Carmen Reyes was reported missing 2 months ago. In Mexico. Daniel's blood ran cold. If Carmen had been missing, but had somehow shown up in Atlanta with a baby, what had she been running from? And more terrifyingly, was she still alive? Shadow let out a quiet, uneasy whine, his body tense. Daniel had spent his career dealing with security threats, smugglers, and criminals. But this wasn't just a case anymore. This was a warning. Something had gone horribly wrong, and he was running out of time to figure out what. Daniel's grip on the edge of the desk tightened. His eyes remained locked on the missing persons report. Carmen Reyes had been gone for 2 months. So why had she resurfaced in Atlanta only to disappear again? Rachel scrolled through the case file, her brow furrowed. Her disappearance was flagged as suspicious. Authorities in Mexico suspected foul play, but there was no proof. Daniel exhaled sharply. And now she turns up at an airport alone, leaves a baby in a suitcase, and vanishes into thin air. No way this is a coincidence. Rachel clicked to another document. There's more. Carmen worked as a journalist. She paused. Investigative. Cartel corruption. Daniel's stomach dropped. She was running for her life. Rachel nodded. Looks like she uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. If she had the baby with her, she either took the child to protect it, or it was leverage. Daniel's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. This was survival. Shadow let out a low growl, ears pinned forward. Daniel followed the dog's gaze to the screen, where the footage replayed on a loop. The way Carmen hesitated before walking away. The way she touched the suitcase one last time. It wasn't hesitation. It was pleading. She wanted someone to find the baby. Daniel muttered, realization sinking in. She knew she was being hunted. She knew she didn't have time. Rachel's phone buzzed, making them both jump. She answered quickly, listened, then paled. Daniel, there's been a report. He stiffened. What kind of report? Rachel hesitated, then looked him dead in the eye. A woman matching Carmen's description was just found in an alley near the airport. She's barely alive. Daniel grabbed his jacket, his heart slamming against his ribs. We need to get to her. Now. Shadow barked once, already sensing the urgency. Time was running out, and if they didn't move fast, they might never get the full story. The SUV's tires screeched as Daniel pulled into the alleyway behind a run-down motel near the airport. Red and blue lights flashed against the damp brick walls, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Paramedics crouched over a figure slumped against the wall, their hurried movements tense with urgency. Daniel jumped out, Shadow leaping to his side as they approached. Rachel was right behind him, her face tight with focus. One of the paramedics glanced up. She's barely conscious, but she's holding on. Daniel's gaze dropped to the woman lying on the pavement. Carmen Reyes. Her face was battered, a deep bruise blooming along her temple. Her clothes were torn, her breathing labored. But despite the pain, her fingers clutched at the paramedic's sleeve as if fighting to hold on. Daniel crouched beside her. Carmen, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, and for a split second, her gaze locked onto his. Fear, desperation, relief. 1,000 unspoken emotions swirled in her dark eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel leaned in closer. You left the baby at the airport. Why? A weak, trembling breath. Safe, she rasped. They can't. Daniel's pulse pounded. Who? Who's after you? Carmen shuddered, her fingers tightening as she struggled for air. Rachel stepped in, her voice urgent but soothing. Carmen, listen to me. The baby is alive. Safe. But we need to know who's after you. Carmen's lips parted, but the effort was too much. Her body convulsed, her breathing ragged. One of the paramedics grabbed an oxygen mask, slipping it over her face. She's going into shock. We need to move her now. Daniel stood, frustration coiling in his chest. She knew something big, and they were running out of time. As the paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, Daniel turned to Rachel. This wasn't a random attack. They knew where to find her. Rachel nodded grimly. And if they knew she was here, they might know about the baby too. Daniel felt a chill creep up his spine. Shadow let out a low, uneasy growl. Whoever Carmen was running from, they weren't finished yet. Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then went pale. Daniel, you're not gonna like this. His stomach dropped. What? She swallowed hard. There's a black SUV parked outside the hospital. She looked up, voice tight with urgency. No plates. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. They're already there. Without another word, he sprinted back to the SUV, Shadow bounding beside him. Rachel was on his heels, barking orders into her phone. If the people after Carmen knew about the baby, then they were already closing in. Daniel's SUV tore through the streets, headlights slicing through the darkness. The hospital was only 10 minutes away, But 10 minutes could be the difference between saving that baby and losing them forever. Rachel gripped the dashboard, her phone still pressed to her ear. Security has eyes on the SUV. No one's gotten out yet, but they're just sitting there. She turned to Daniel. They're waiting for something. Daniel's jaw clenched. Or someone. Shadow, sensing the tension, let out a deep growl from the back seat. Daniel pressed harder on the gas. Tell security not to approach. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. The hospital's lights came into view just as Rachel's phone buzzed again. She answered, listened for 2 seconds, then cursed under her breath. They're moving. Daniel's stomach dropped. Too late. He swung into the hospital lot just as the black SUV peeled away from the entrance. Security officers stood frozen outside. Caught off guard, Daniel didn't hesitate. He slammed the SUV into park and jumped out, Shadow right at his heels. A nurse rushed toward them, her face pale. The baby, someone just tried to take him. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. Where is he now? With the doctor. We locked the unit down as soon as we saw the men outside. Rachel grabbed Daniel's arm. This wasn't just about Carmen. They wanted that baby. Daniel's fists clenched. He didn't know why, but he knew one thing for certain. They had just stopped something much bigger. And whoever they were, they wouldn't stop trying. The hospital hallway was eerily silent except for the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of hushed voices. Daniel stood outside the neonatal unit, his hands braced on his hips, his heart still racing from the adrenaline surge. Shadow sat obediently beside him, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway, as if expecting another threat to emerge at any moment. Inside the secure unit, the baby, the tiny, fragile child who had been stuffed into a suitcase and left for strangers to find, slept peacefully in an incubator. A nurse had wrapped him in a fresh blue blanket, his chest rising and falling in soft, rhythmic breaths. Rachel appeared at Daniel's side, exhaling a long, tired breath. Hospital security checked the footage. The men in the SUV never made it inside. But they weren't just scouting. Daniel turned to her, jaw tight. They were looking for a window of opportunity. She nodded. If they were cartel-connected, they might have been testing security before making a move. Daniel felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop. The question was, why did they want this baby so badly? Rachel ran a hand through her hair. I talked to the doctors. The baby is stable, but he was severely dehydrated. If we hadn't found him when we did. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Daniel clenched his fists. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. Shadow had saved this baby's life. And Carmen, she had risked everything to make sure someone found him. A nurse approached, her expression cautious. Ms. Reyes is awake. Daniel's breath caught. He exchanged a glance with Rachel. She's asking for you, the nurse added. Without hesitation, Daniel followed her down the corridor, Shadow padding silently beside him. Carmen looked weaker than before, her face pale against the stark white hospital sheets. An oxygen mask rested beside her, and N4 dripped fluids into her arm. But when she saw Daniel, her dark eyes flickered with something that hadn't been there before, relief. He pulled a chair closer and sat down. Carmen, he said, his voice softer than usual. The baby is safe. A tear slipped down her cheek. She exhaled shakily, whispering, Thank you. Daniel leaned forward. Who were those men? Why were they after the child? Her lips trembled. Because he isn't mine. Rachel, standing behind Daniel, stiffened. Carmen took a deep breath. I was investigating a trafficking ring in Mexico, babies being taken, sold to the highest bidder. I went undercover, trying to expose them. She closed her eyes, voice breaking. But I got too close. Daniel's got twisted. He knew it. This wasn't just about one child. This was something bigger. Carmen swallowed hard. I found records of babies who had vanished. Their families were told they were stillborn or died at birth. But they were alive. Being taken. Sold. She shuddered. When they realized what I knew, they came for me. They killed my source. Burned down my apartment. I had no choice but to run. Rachel inhaled sharply. And the baby? Carmen's eyes filled with sorrow. He was supposed to be smuggled into the U.S. for a buyer. I intercepted him before they could complete the handoff. But I knew I wouldn't make it far. Daniel exhaled slowly. So you left him where someone had to find him? Carmen nodded, her body shaking. I thought if I could at least get him into the system, they wouldn't be able to take him back. Silence settled over the room. Rachel was the first to speak. If what you're saying is true, there could be dozens of children out there. Carmen's voice was barely a whisper. Hundreds. Daniel felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. This wasn't over. The men who had come for the baby, they weren't just criminals. They were part of something larger, something ruthless. And they wouldn't stop just because one child had slipped through their grasp. But neither would Daniel. He looked at Rachel, saw the same determination in her eyes. We'll protect the baby, he promised. But we need to stop them. Carmen nodded, a new fire in her gaze. Then let's finish what they tried to stop. The morning sun bled through the hospital blinds, casting golden streaks across the sterile white walls. The night had been long, filled with conversations that would change lives. Carmen sat up in her hospital bed, her bruises dark but her spirit unbroken. Across from her, Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped, his expression firm but understanding. Rachel stood beside him, her phone already buzzing with law enforcement contacts. The baby, the child who had been left in that suitcase, nearly lost to the world, slept peacefully in the neonatal unit, watched over by nurses who had already fallen in love with his tiny, fragile presence. We'll keep him safe, Rachel assured. We're involving federal agencies. They'll track down the men who were after you and dismantle the operation. Carmen exhaled, eyes glassy. This is bigger than just me. I can testify. I have documents, names, proof of what they've been doing. But I need protection. Daniel nodded. You'll get it. They won't touch you again. For the first time in weeks, Carmen looked like she believed it. Outside the hospital, the black SUV was gone. Law enforcement had traced it to an abandoned parking lot, wiped clean of any evidence. But they weren't stopping there. This was just the beginning of something bigger. Daniel looked at Shadow, who lay at his feet, tail flicking. He reached down and scratched the dog's ears. You saved a life, buddy. Shadow let out a soft huff, his job done, his instincts never failing. Carmen wiped away a tear and smiled. Not just one. A week later, the baby, now given the name Mateo, was placed under protective care. Authorities had begun unraveling the trafficking network, and with Carmen's testimony, arrests were already being made. As Daniel watched Mateo being held by a foster mother who couldn't stop crying, something inside him shifted. This child had almost disappeared into the void, almost been lost forever. But fate, and a dog with an unshakable nose, had other plans. Walking out of the hospital, Daniel glanced at Rachel. You think this is the end? She shook her head. No, but it's a start. Shadow trotted ahead, tail wagging, nose to the air, always searching, always sensing. And as Daniel followed, he knew that no matter what came next, they had done something that mattered. They had saved a life,